Okay, so for the asynchronous portion of today, along with the Phantom Limb assignment, I want you to watch this brief lecture, should only be about 10 minutes or so, about how we know about the brain. Okay, how do we actually study the brain? So we've talked about before there was brain imaging, before the technology that we have now, really the only way to know about the brain was through brain damage. Is what's called a lesion. Okay. A lesion is any sort of destruction of brain tissue, whether it happens naturally, like from a stroke, or if it happens experimentally, like in the case of HM, who we watched yesterday, the guy whose hippocampus was destroyed. Okay, so any sort of destruction of brain tissue. And then, just like Phineas Gage, you destroy the brain tissue, the brain tissue is destroyed, and then they're able to see what happens from that. So, lesion, any sort of destruction of brain tissue. The way that we know about it now is through using brain imaging. And I'm going to give you pretty simple ways to remember each one of these. They are either going to look at structure or function, or in case of one, both. And then I'm going to give you keywords that would go along. If you were to get a test question asking which brain imaging technique is being used, almost always you would have a certain keyword that would go along with it. So the least detailed, the least effective of these types of brain scans is what is called a CAT scan or a CT scan, computerized tomography, mapping the brain using a computer. Right? These have been around for a long time. They're not used quite as much anymore because of radiation and because they're not as detailed. The key words, so these look at the structure, okay, and the key word is X-rays, to look for brain damage, whatever it is. So for instance, right there, it looks like they may have some sort of lesion or tumor right there. These are not very detailed with the brain. They're better with bones because they are not good with soft tissue, such as what the brain is made up of or muscles, things like that. So CAT scan, least detailed, keyword is X-rays. MRI is what we use now more often than not. If we are just looking for some sort of brain damage, if we are looking at brain structure, okay? The key word here in MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. You don't need to know how this works. It's something about little magnetic particles getting swirled around, whatnot. I don't really understand it. But the key word in the question would be magnetic field. Okay, and you can see how much more detailed this is than a CAT scan. So for instance, right here, what they're looking at here is the ventricles of the brain. This patient right here is likely schizophrenic based off of the size of their ventricles, which are these kind of holes that are in the middle of our brain that have cerebrospinal fluid. So the better way to look at brain structure is through the use of MRIs. So those are the two that look exclusively at structure. Now we're going on to function. EEGs, electroencephalogram. Okay, EEGs use this kind of cap that has electrodes on it pressed up against your skull to record brain waves, such as the ones right here. As we know, the neurons, the action potentials put off electrical signals. So the EEGs measure electrical activity within the brain to see how the brain is functioning. This is used for sleep studies. We'll talk about this more when we get to sleep eventually. Used for sleep studies to measure brain waves during sleep. It's used for epilepsy. They will often, if they're testing for epilepsy or a seizure disorder, they will induce a seizure in somebody's brain. And they're able to see, based off of these brain waves, where the seizure is coming from in the cerebral cortex. One of the problems with these is that it can only measure the top layer of the brain. It cannot look deep into the brain like at the limbic system or the brainstem. It only measures the electrical activity on the outside of the cerebral cortex. PET scans. Okay. PET scans are another way to look at function, where PET scan stands for positron emission tomography. What they do with these is they will have the patient whose brain they're looking at go drink, or they will inject a non-harmful form of radioactive glucose. It's kind of like, you can kind of compare it to like highlighter fluid. Glucose is what the brain uses for energy. So what they will do is they will have them, they will inject them with this radioactive glucose, and then they will give them tasks to do. And they can see where the radioactive glucose is traveling in the brain. So you can see here, when somebody's looking at words, this looks like it's right on the edge of the occipital lobe, probably around the angular gyrus. Here, it's in the temporal lobe, right? This is right around Wernicke's area here. So you're able to see which areas are functioning during any given task. And then lastly, the fMRI. The fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging. fMRI looks at structure and function. It looks at you can see here, you can see this is pictures taken from going from the top of the brain, the eyeballs. Okay, you can see the thalamus right there, top of the brain, going all the way down to going all the way up to the cerebral cortex here. Okay, so this one looks at structure by using magnetic resonance imaging, and then it looks at function by using, instead of using radioactive glucose, fMRIs are able to measure the movement of blood flow, which is carrying oxygen. Because not only is the brain using glucose, it uses oxygen as well. So it measures what's called BOLD, blood oxygen level dependent, to where during certain tasks, you can see exactly where that blood flow is going with the oxygen, which would lead them to, because they can see the structure in such detail, they can see exactly what part of a structure might be damaged and might not be getting blood flow to it. So keywords with this one, oxygen in blood flow. There you go. That is all you need to know about brain imaging.